Hi, it's Grandma here, and I'm reading A Long Way from Chicago. And the chapter that I'm reading is a one-woman crime wave. And we are working on prediction in this particular chapter. I've stopped halfway through the chapter to review. Grandma and Joy and Mary Alice have been out fishing for catfish, but they didn't have any poles. Do you remember how they were catching catfish? In crates. Grandma used her cheese, and they went for the cheese, and very smelly cheese, and they got trapped inside these crates. Grandma has borrowed the sheriff's boat without his permission, and she has trespassed at the Gun and Rod Club without their permission, and she is using catfish traps, which is illegal. When they were on their way back, they went by the Gun and Rod Club and noticed that all of the business leaders of town, including the sheriff, were drunk, dancing and singing in their underwear outside. And Grandma saw them all. Then Grandma got close enough that the sheriff saw that she had his boat. And he said, "Stop, in the name of the law, that's my boat." So let's predict what's going to happen. Do you think Grandma somehow is going to talk her way out of it? Do you think the sheriff is going to arrest them? Or do you have another idea as to what could happen? Before the Rod and Gun Club was out of sight, Grandma had regained control of the oars. She rowed on as if none of this had ever happened. So she didn't talk to him, and she wasn't arrested. She just ignored them. The sun was beating down, so she didn't push herself. After all, the sheriff couldn't chase us downstream. We were in his boat. Around another bend, and a flock of turtles sunning on stumps, Grandma pulled for the remains of an old dock. We tied up there, and now we were out of the boat, climbing a bluff. Grandma led, dragging the net of catfish. I was in the rear, doing my best with the picnic hamper. Mary Alice was between us, watching where she walked. She was scareder of snakes than she let on, if you ask me. An old house without a speck of paint on it stood tall on the bluff. Its outbuildings had caved in, and the privy stood at an angle. There were still prairie chickens around in those days, and they were pecking dirt. Otherwise, the place looked lifeless. Rags hung at the windows. The porch overlooking the creek had fallen off. Grandma tramped around to the far side of the house. She dropped her fish on the ground and waved us inside. Even in full daylight, the place looked haunted. I didn't want to go in, but Mary Alice was marching through the door already, so I had to. "Is anybody inside?" I whispered to Grandma as I lugged the hamper past her. "Oh, nobody but Aunt Puss Chapman," she said, like anybody would know that. It had been a fine house once. A wide black walnut staircase rose to a landing window with most of its stained glass still in. But it was creepy in here, dim and dusty. Smelled funny, too. We went into a room piled with furniture. Then one of the chairs spoke. "Where you been, girl?" Mary Alice flinched, but the old woman lost in the chair was staring straight at Grandma and calling her girl. She was by many years the oldest person we'd ever seen up until then. Bald as an egg, but she needed a shave, and not a tooth in her head. "Who's them chillin' with you?" she demanded of Grandma. "Oh, just kids I found along the creek bed," Grandma said to our surprise. "They were fishing." I don't know as I want them in the house." Aunt Puss Chapman sent us a mean look. "Do they steal?" "Nothing you got," Grandma said under her breath. "Talk up, girl," Aunt Puss said. "You mumble. I've spoken to you before about that." She pulled her shawl closer, though it was the hottest day of the year. "I'm hungry. You hightail it out of here after breakfast, and I ain't seen hide nor hoof of you since." "She ain't seen me for a week," Grandma mumbled to us, "but she forgets." Then she called out to Aunt Puss, "Catfish and fried potatoes and onions, vinegar slaw and pickled peach apiece, and more of the same for your supper." "I suppose it beats starving," Aunt Puss snapped. "But hop to it, girl. Stir your stumps." I thought I might faint again. Nobody could talk to Grandma like that and live. She led us back to an old-time kitchen. It was in bad shape, but well stocked. Big sacks of potatoes and onions and cornmeal, things in cans, and we'd brought a full hamper to add to Aunt Puss's larder. I had to fire up the stove with a bunch of kindling while Grandma and Mary Alice went to work on the potatoes and onions. Mary Alice was in as big a daze as I was. "Grandma, is that nasty old lady your aunt?" I stopped to listen. If she was, that made her our great-great-aunt. "Nah, I was a hired girl to her before I was married," Grandma said. "Lived in this house and fetched and carried for her and slept in the attic." "You had a room in the attic?" "No, I just slept up there. Had a bed tick with straw in it and changed it every spring. I haven't always lived in the luxury you see me in now." "What did she pay you, Grandma?" "Pay? She didn't pay me a plug nickel, but she fed me." I thought about that. "And now you feed her," I said, but Grandma didn't reply. We cleaned the fish on a plank table outdoors. I didn't care much for it. It made me kind of sick to hear Grandma rip the skin off the catfish. She had her own quick way of doing that, but every time it sounded like the fish screamed. She put me in charge of chopping off their heads, but I didn't like chopping off the heads of anything looking back at me. And catfish have mustaches for some reason, which is just plain weird. And whoop, she'd bring down the blade and that fish head would go flying. Mary Alice was good at it, so I let her do it. Grandma gutted. It was afternoon before we sat down at the dining room table under a cobwebby gaselier. Aunt Puss was already at her place, so she was sprier than she looked. Grandma settled at the foot of the table. Without her hat, her white hair hung in damp tendrils. We'd been working like a whole pack of bird dogs. Watching Aunt Puss gum catfish was not a pretty sight. "These fish taste muddy," she observed. "You uns catch 'em?" "Yes," I said. "No," Mary Alice said. "What did you use for bait?" Aunt Puss said, looking at both of us. "Cheese," I said. "Worms," Mary Alice said more wisely. Since we couldn't get together on our story, Aunt Puss changed the subject. "You chillun still in school?" We nodded. "Do they whoop you?" "Do they what?" Mary Alice said. "Do they paddle your behind when you need it?" Aunt Puss looked interested. "If they did, I'd quit school," said Mary Alice, who had just completed 3rd grade. "They whooped that girl raw." Aunt Puss pointed her fork down the table at Grandma. I had a sudden thought. Aunt Puss thought Grandma and Mary Alice and I were all the same age. She hadn't noticed the years passing. That's why Grandma didn't say we were her grandkids. It was just a mixed-up Aunt Puss. "That's when she came to work for me. They'd throwed her out of school." Aunt Puss peered down the table. "Tell 'em why." We looked at Grandma, naturally interested to know why she'd been thrown out of school. Grandma waved us away. "Oh, I forget," she said. "I don't." Aunt Puss waved a fork. "It was because you wadded up your underdrawers to stop up the flue on the stove and smoke out the schoolhouse. That was the end of your education." "Work for you was an education," Grandma muttered, though only Mary Alice and I heard. It took us another hour to clean up the kitchen the way Grandma wanted to leave it. When it was time for us to go, Aunt Puss was back in her chair in the parlor. "Where do you think you're off to now?" she called out as we trooped down the front hall. "Down to the sty to slop the hogs," Grandma called back. "Well, don't dawdle. You dawdle, and I've spoken to you about that before. Get on out of here." Aunt Puss hollered, "Let the door hit you where the dog hit you, where the dog bit you." Outdoors, I said, "Does she have hogs?" "Oh, she used to," Grandma said. "She was right well off at one time. She's poor now, but don't know it." How could she? She still had her hired girl and plenty to eat. You take her food every week, don't you, Grandma? Yeah, generally a good big roast chicken. She can gum that for days. Grandma turned down the lane. It keeps her out of the poor farm, and it gives me a quiet day in the country. That's a fair swap. Then her jaw clenched in its way. But it's just private business between her and me, and I don't tell my private business. We walked country roads all the way home. Grandma set a brisk pace, and I struggled along behind with a hamper heavy with cleaned fish. Mary Alice went in the middle, watching where she walked. By the time we got home, the trees in Grandma's yard were throwing long shadows, and it was evening in her kitchen. Mary Alice and I were both staggering. I was ready to go up to bed. But Grandma said, "Skin down to the cellar and bring up 15 or 20 bottles of my beer. Just carry 2 at a time. I don't want any broke." I whimpered. But she was turning on Mary Alice. "And you and me's going to fry up a couple of pecks of potatoes to go with that fish. There won't be nothing to it. I peeled the potatoes this morning before you two was up." We stared. The catfish fried in long pans with the potatoes and onions at the other end popping in the grease. The kitchen was blue with smoke, and night was at the windows before we finished up. You know what this reminds me of? Eating at my grandma's house. Every Friday night, we had catfish, fried potatoes, fried onions. Oh, sometimes the onions were raw, and fresh tomatoes sliced. I loved that supper. I thought it was the best. Meanwhile, back to our story. Following her lead, we carried everything out into the night, making many trips. We lugged it all across the road and up to the Wabash Railroad right away and planted the card table in the gravel. Finally, the platters of fish and potatoes overlapped on the table, and the open beer bottles stood in a row beside the tracks. As the drifters came along, being hounded out of town, Grandma gave them a good feed and a beer to wet their whistles. Mary Alice helped in an apron of Grandma's that dragged the ground. They were hollow-eyed men who couldn't believe their luck. 2 or 3 of them, 5 or 6, then a bunch standing around the table eating with both hands, sharing out the beer. They didn't say much. They didn't thank her. She wasn't looking for thanks. She'd taken off her overalls and put the same wash dress back on, but she tied a fresh apron over it. Her hair was a mess, fanning out from the bun at the back, white in the moonlight. She watched them feed, working her mouth. Then she saw the swinging lanterns, the sheriff and his deputies, coming along behind to keep the drifters moving. Up trooped O.B. Dickerson, dressed now with his badge on and his belt full of bullets, riding low under his belly. His deputies loomed behind him, but they weren't singing Sweet Adeline. Okay, break it up," he said, elbowing through the drifters. Then he came to Grandma. "Dag nabbit, Mrs. Dowdle, you're everywhere I turn. You're all over me like white on rice. Now, what do you think you're doing?" "I'm giving these boys the first eats they've had today." "Or yesterday," a drifter said. "Mrs. Dowdle, let me explain something to you," the sheriff bawled. "We don't want to feed the loafers. We want them out of town." "They are out of town." Grandma pointed her spatula at the sheriff's feet. "The town stops there. We're in the county." "Yes, and I'm sheriff of the county," O.B. Dickerson bellowed. "You're in my jurisdiction." "Oh, do tell," Grandma said. "Run me in." The minute she said that, all the drifters looked up. That was when Sheriff Dickerson's deputies saw they were outnumbered. "Mrs. Dowdle," the sheriff boomed, "I wouldn't know what to charge you with first. You're a one-woman crime wave. Where'd you get them fish, for instance?" he said, wisely overlooking the home brews in the drifters' hands. "Out of a trap in Salt Creek," Grandma remarked. "Same as you get yours." O.B. Dickerson's eyes bulged. "You accusing me, the sheriff of Piatt County, of running fish traps?" He poked his own chest with a pudgy finger. "Not this morning," Grandma replied. "You was too drunk." The drifters chuckled. "And talking about this morning," the sheriff said, his face shading purple even in the darkness, "you stole my boat. That's what we call larceny, Mrs. Dowdle. You could go up for that." "Oh, well, the boat." Grandma made a little gesture with the spatula. "You'll find it tied up at Aunt Puss Chapman's dock. As a rule, I take it back where you tie it up, but of course I couldn't do that this morning. How could I row those grandkids of mine past that rod and gun club? They'd already seen what no child should. The sheriff and his deputies, blind drunk and naked as jaybirds, dancing jigs on the porch, and I don't know what all. It's like to have marked this girl for life." Grandma nudged Mary Alice, who stood there in the big apron looking drooped and damaged. "I'm thinking about taking her to the doctor so she can talk it out. I don't want her to develop one of them complexes, you know." "Whoa!" the deputy murmured behind Sheriff Dickerson. Earl T. Askew stepped up and said into his ears, "O.B., let's just let sleeping dogs lie. I got my hands full with Mrs. Askew as it is." The sheriff simmered some. "Okay, Earl, if you say so." The sheriff and his posse were in retreat now, but he had to cover himself. "Mrs. Dowdle," he said, pulling a long face, "these things I can overlook, but it seems to me you're running a soup kitchen without a license from the Board of Health. I have an idea there's a law against that on the books." "Go look it up, O.B., Grandma said. "See if there's a law against feeding the hungry. But I have to tell you, you've talked so long, the evidence is all eat up." And of course it was. The drifters had wolfed down the last morsel. With a small finger, Mary Alice pointed out the bare platters. Only a faint scent of fried catfish lingered on the night air. The empty beer bottles went without saying. The drifters were moving off down the track, and the deputies were heading back into town. Obie Dickerson spit in the gravel, swung around, and followed them, his big boots grinding gravel. We stacked the platters and rounded up the beer bottles for Grandma's next batch. I collapsed the legs on the card table. There wasn't a lot of music in Grandma, but she was humming as we worked, and I thought I recognized the tune. "The night that Patty Murphy died, I never shall forget." Then, after our quiet day in the country, we carried everything back across the road under a $silver moon. So, what about Grandma? Is she a criminal for doing all that? Is she doing it for selfish reasons, or does she do these things to help other people? What do you think? In the first story, she gave Shotgun Cheatham a wake with people who came and paid their respects, and she got him buried properly. And Effie got a new outhouse in the next story, which was Mouse in the Milk. And now she has fed the hungry drifters. She has fed Puss. What do you think? Well, maybe we'll learn a little bit more about Grandma in our next chapter, which is the Day of Judgment. And another year will have passed. It will be 1932. Bye-bye.